Hi everyone, I'm so excited to share my new video series on sewing basics with you. Whether you're just starting out or looking to improve your skills, in this series I'll guide you step by step. Along the way we'll be creating something really special, a sewing resource binder that you'll build as you follow along. To get started you'll need a 3-ring binder, some inexpensive inserts, and some sample fabrics. These can be scraps from old clothes or bedding, or even some inexpensive remnants from the fabric store. Here's the fun part. In each lesson, we'll sew a sample of the technique we're learning together, and by making the samples and following along with me, you won't just learn the techniques, you'll create your very own sewing technique binder. This will become an invaluable and timeless resource to refer to for all your sewing projects. It is a fantastic way to take your skills to the next level and build a solid foundation for any sewing challenge. Let me show you an example of my binder. On the left side, I've got the notes and some little sketches I made about the technique, and on the right side is where I would put the actual sewing sample. It's such a great way to stay organized and have everything you need at your fingertips. If you'd like to use my notes and sketches for your binder, let me know in the comments. If there's enough interest, I'll share a downloadable link so you can print them out and use them too. Let's make something amazing together, one stitch at a time. So without further ado, let's get started. In this lesson, we're going to learn all about basting stitches and how they're essential for easing fabric or testing your project when you're sewing. I'll walk you through what a basting stitch is, why it's important, and I'll show you a couple of different examples where these techniques come in handy, like matching patterns or creating ruffles or gathers. By the end, you'll be able to use basting stitches whenever you need them. So let's start with the basics. What is a basting stitch? It's a long temporary stitch that holds fabric in place while you sew. Think of it like a placeholder. It's easy to adjust and remove if you need to. Basting can be done by hand, or you can do it with a sewing machine by setting the stitch length to the longest setting, usually around 4 or 5 millimeters. Remember, since this is temporary, don't backstitch at the beginning or end of the seam. This way it can be pulled out later without any issues. So when would we use a basting stitch? A few common situations would be fitting garments. When you want to test fit a seam or a hemline, baste it first to see how it looks before you make it permanent. That's one way. Fitting garments. When you want to test fit a seam or a hemline, you might want to use a baste to see how it looks before you make it permanent. Gathering fabric. If you want to make gathers, you baste along the seam line and you pull the thread to bunch up the fabric evenly and create beautiful gathers. Okay, so now let's go ahead and make a couple of samples. So for these samples, I have a sample fabric here, 2 pieces of fabric that have stripes. You could have any pattern. It doesn't have to be stripes. You could use plaid or something with a pattern that when you sew them together, you want things to line up and match. So I'll be using striped fabric for my patterns. Then for the second sample that we're going to create, you'll need 2 pieces of fabric. One is going to be slightly smaller and one is going to be slightly longer. And don't worry about it. You could do a 4-inch and a 6-inch, or you could do a 2-inch and a 4-inch. Really doesn't matter as long as you have one piece longer and one piece shorter. They can be the same size or different sizes. Let's start with matching patterns. So you'll need a needle and some thread, because we're going to be hand basting this together to match the stripes. So whenever you're hand sewing, if you're having trouble threading the needle, you want to cut the thread at a diagonal to give it that nice sharp edge, and then try to thread your needle. There's also, of course, little tools you can use to thread your needle as well. And one other thing to keep in mind when you're basting, it's a good idea to use a contrasting color thread so that when you go to remove it, you can easily see it so you can remove it. So if you're using white fabric, don't use white thread, maybe use black thread. So here I'm using a slightly light yellow on this fabric. I could have used a brighter color to see it, but I think this is contrast enough that I'll be able to easily see it and remove it. So of course you knot one end of the thread, and then when we hand baste, just make sure your stitches are nice and long, 4 to 5 millimeters wide or longer. You just want it to be long enough that it's easy to remove, and it's short enough that it actually holds the fabric together. So you don't want it to be extra long. So here I'm carefully making sure each stripe matches because I'm using this linen and it looks like it has a little bit of give to where it could stretch out. I'm making sure also to place my basting stitch along the edge so that it's going to be inside my seam allowance. So if your seam allowance is a half, you could baste at a quarter. If your seam allowance is 5/8, you could do it at a half, as long as it's inside the seam allowance, not behind the seam allowance. That way, when you do the permanent stitch, you can easily remove it. So now on your machine, I'm setting my stitch to a permanent stitch, and I'm carefully going to go ahead and stitch my patterned pieces together. You can see they were basted, so my stripes should match up when I'm done permanently stitching these two together. And there you have it. So I'll open up my stitch or my fabric, and I can ensure that my pattern is matched appropriately. Like here, my stripes, it looks good. And then what we're gonna do is we're just gonna pull one end of this basting thread, and I'm going to gently pull it out of the fabric. And there you go, that was the basting stitch. The purpose here was to match the pattern of these two pieces together. It matches well. Now I can go to my iron and I can press open my permanent seam, and I'm done matching this pattern together. And that completes our first example of using a basting stitch to match patterns. In the next one, we're gonna create a little ruffled sample using a basting stitch. And there you go. I usually like to put it behind a piece of paper, and then to put it in my binder, I'm going to maybe take this down to this piece of paper and stick it inside that little plastic sleeve or insert in my 3-ring binder, and I'll put it in my 3-ring binder. So now for our gathered example using basting stitches, I've got 2 pieces of fabric. One piece is longer and one piece is shorter. I'm taking the long piece and I'm setting my machine here to the highest on my machine, which is a 6. and I've set my fabric at about a 1/2 inch is where I'm basting along the edge of this, because I'm going to be using this as if this was a 5/8 seam allowance. Now when I pull it out, I go ahead and pull it so that there's a long piece of thread at the end. I don't want to cut it too close, so I have some thread on one end to start pulling to create gathers. So now next I'm going to create another row of basting stitch starting from the opposite end that I started in the first one, and it's going to be 1/8 of an inch away from this other baste. Usually you'll want to create 2 rows of basting stitch if you have a very long piece that you're trying to gather. If you've got a long piece and you're trying to gather it and you pull the thread and then it breaks, you're going to lose that gathering and you'll have to start over. But if you have 2 pieces, you pull half of it from one direction. So I'll start maybe here on the left side and pull and create some gathers. You just gently pull and start creating some gathers in your fabric. Then I'll pull on the other end of the second row or the first row that I created, and I'll gently pull it to create gathers on the other end until I reach the center, and then I'll try to even these gathers out so that they're nice and even all the way across. Now that I have my piece gathered, I'm going to take the shorter piece and I'm going to match it up with my gathered piece, and I'm going to pin these 2 pieces together. And I'm just going to go ahead and adjust the gathers, make sure everything looks pretty even. And once I'm satisfied with how it looks, I'm going to go to my machine and I'm going to switch that the stitch length back down to about a 2.5, which is a standard basic seam. And now I'm going to stitch a permanent seam at a 5/8 seam allowance all the way across to sew these 2 pieces together. And remember, when you're making a permanent stitch, to back stitch at the beginning and back stitch again at the very end. And as you can see, my basting stitch is inside the seam allowance. That way, when I'm done making the permanent stitch, I can easily pull these out. And again, I've used contrasting thread so I can easily see it and remove it. And there you go. I have pulled out the basting stitches, and I'm going to trim any extra threads on this. And now I can go to my iron and I can press these seams open, or press them at least to one side. And there you go. You've got these nice little gathered And there we go. We have a nice little gathered sample here. This could be curtains. This could be a skirt, a dress, anywhere where you want to add some gathering. This comes very handy. And that completes our 2 samples for this project. So we matched patterns and we created some ruffles. Now what I'll do is I'll put these in my binder for future reference, and that completes my 2 samples. Now I'm going to go ahead and put this in my binder and keep it for a future resource. I hope you guys enjoyed this video, and I hope you did follow along and take your own notes. If you enjoyed it, please hit the like button and subscribe to my channel. See you guys in the next episode. Ciao!